The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in the podcast belong solely to the hosts and not the host's past, present, or future employers. Hey everybody, welcome back. Brian, Mr. Betcher, and Ms. Berlin for Breaking Down Security. Hey. Yeah, so we took a break last week. To be honest, it was a really shitty week between all of the news going on with the various trials happening. We had some of our BreakSec family here lost people. I had a fairly devastating cancer finding out of a family member myself, and it just wasn't a good week. So we appreciate everybody's thoughts and well wishes. We're hopefully feeling better. And of course, this is the day after we found out about Dan Kaminsky, one of I would call him a giant in our industry. A lot of great, heartfelt stories and discussions on Twitter about this gentleman who pretty much, I would say, was one of the big advocates in the responsible disclosure movement, all the way back in 2008 when he discovered the DNS bug that he was famous, or what put him on the map in the InfoSec community. So our thoughts, the BreakSec family's thoughts, go out to Dan Kaminsky and his family, and we hope that they find some peace during this time. So. I did not know the man personally. I wish, and now seeing all the people talking about him on Twitter, I wish I'd had. Maybe that's a reason to go to DEF CON. Seems like he loved him some DEF CON and some Black Hat, and I never went to those. So maybe that's why I was unable to get to meet him. So. So our condolences to Dan Kaminsky's family and friends and relatives and InfoSec family. So, and also in the same vein, one of our BreakSec guests, Spencer Geitzen, a couple weeks ago, also passed away. Don't know why or heard about it. I just heard about it from a mutual friend of ours. He used to work with me at Leviathan, and very talented person. Started working at CrowdStrike about 9 months ago, and he worked on the AWS testing framework Paku. We had him on the show talking about it quite a bit. You can go back, I think, and we'll have a link in our show notes of this show that you can go back and listen to him talk about that. Very passionate blue teamer and pen tester and red teamer. And we're just, it's just weird times we're living in. And it just seems like every person we lose, it just kind of magnifies all that. So, didn't want to bring everybody down, but I just felt like that needed to be said. I know Miss Berlin lost a friend as well, so my condolences to you, Miss Berlin, and hope you're feeling better. So
takes time, right?
Yeah, time and tide, and it still hurts, but you gotta just remember the good stuff, and it does get easier, I hope. So, but anyway, so I want to go ahead and get on with the show this week. On the heels of a very active news week, there was a story. It kind of got, I don't want to say buried, but there was not a lot of people that heard about it, or maybe didn't understand the ramifications of it. And I wanted to talk about it this week with the group here. So there was a story that came out on the Linux kernel mailing list where he's Greg HK on Twitter. He's one of the kernel developers and had been discussing some patches with University of Minnesota doctoral students, PhD students, and had come to find out that some of the patches that they had introduced into the Linux kernel, one, did not help, and there was some initial thoughts that these were actually deliberately vulnerable patches that were being added to the kernel in an effort to make a point that people aren't doing necessary checks and balances on commits that are being added. We've talked a lot in the past, and I know we've had people from JSOF and other folks on talking about supply chain security issues. The Linux kernel is running in pretty much anything IoT based. If you've got any kind of IoT device out there that you use for voice recognition or authorization, I believe my entertainment center and my Tesla runs on Linux.
I do feel like we all have been kind of in just the position, I imagine, if it was like intentional, where that person's head might have been.
Right. Well,
like I've been telling people for 5 years while I've been working here, putting patches in, that they don't go through the proper procedures, blah, blah, blah. And then just one day you snap, you're like, you know what? I'm going to show them.
Right. So, well, yeah, that,
maybe not, but it's just, it's the first thing that pops in my head.
I'm going to remind everyone to stay on Ms. Berlin's good side, because the power she wields is such that, yeah. So, I do want to bring our guest on, because she has a very interesting point of view on this. When we were talking about some of the academia of it, she said, "Oh yeah, I've sat in on some of those," and so I want to invite Paige on. Paige is one of also, in addition to working in academia, she also is one of the moderators of our BreakSec Slack, which you can get a DM and join our community by hitting us up on Twitter at BreakSec on Twitter, or bds.podcast@gmail.com. So Paige, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
Cool. You've been in our book club a few times. I know what you do, but maybe you could give people a little background on what it is that you do for InfoSec and security.
So I am cybersecurity for a very large K-12 in Texas. I've got more than 60,000 users and not a very large team, and we'll go with that. And before that, I was in academia in a completely unrelated field for about 10 years. Did the whole tenure thing and got bored and got out.
Okay. And you've had to go through some of the stuff that these PhD doctoral students have gone through, correct?
Yeah, I've submitted more IRBs than I'd care to think about.
Okay. All right. And we'll get to what an IRB here is in a minute. So, so let me see. So the initial discussion on the Twitter or the Linux kernel mailing list goes from Greg HK, and he says, you and your group have publicly admitted to sending known buggy patches to see how the kernel community would react to them, and published a paper based on that work. Now you submit a new series of obviously incorrect patches again. So what am I supposed to think of such a thing? They were obviously not created by a static analysis tool that is of any intelligence, as they are all the result of totally different patterns, and all of which are obviously not even fixing anything at all. What am I supposed to think here, other than that you and your group are continuing to experiment on the kernel community developers by sending nonsense patches? This came out a couple days after the one of the students, Aditya Paki, had asked him to cease and desist in making accusations that were bordering on slander, and said that the patches that they were sending were part of a new static analyzer tool that they had written. So here's what I'm. When I first proposed this to Miss Berlin, Mr. Betcher, and we brought Paige in, my first thought was, yes, we're going to nail these people to the floor. How dare they submit, supply chain attack. And I was walking around yesterday even, and I started thinking about these folks, and I'm like, how often do developers knowingly or unknowingly, in this case, put vulnerabilities into the Linux kernel? And that was my thought. I kind of turned my thinking process on the head here. It was like, Mr. Betcher, he's a developer. How often do you put vulnerabilities in your in your packages?
Well,
No,
you have to separate.
I don't mean to. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I understand. You have to separate unknowing from knowing. Right. I never knowingly do it.
Right.
Unknowingly, I mean, whenever there's a patch, somebody unknowingly puts something in there that, most of the time was a bug or could have used some enhancement of some sort, right? If you think about it that way. So, I mean, was this unknowing, or did they try to see if the Linux kernel was vulnerable by knowingly put something in?
Well, so the way I understand it, they actually submitted 190 patches to the Linux kernel for various things. You can go and read the discussion. I believe there's a separate discussion that highlights just the changes and fixes that are having to be pulled out of the list. There was a discussion or talk that some of these deliberately vulnerable patches did make it into the stable kernel and will have to be fixed in 5.13. So they knowingly. Deliberate. Right. And their white paper, which there's a link in our show notes to their white paper, also mentioned the fact that we're going to introduce some use after free bugs that are, going to be added to the kernel. They took a specific vulnerability type and added it to the kernel. So they added additional vulnerabilities as if it wasn't already vulnerable enough to the kernel. So yes, you're right, Mr. Betcher. There's a difference between unknowing and being deliberate in adding those things and doing it in such a way as to not disclose that there were actually vulnerabilities in there. So Paige, you work in academia, and you have been for the past 15, 20 years. You've probably been involved with some software development at some point. I mean, what is your take on all this?
So I haven't really done software development, but I've done a lot with IRB, and I've dealt a lot with people who did not think that what they were doing should be subject to IRB.
Mm-hmm.
And my first take on it was, this is what the hell is going on here? This is deception. That's pretty much automatic full board IRB review.
Right.
I understand how they could think that there was no human involvement here because we're just dealing with people over the internet. And that's not a real person in some ways.
Right. So I want to back it up a little bit for those that are not in academia. What is an IRB?
Okay, so IRB is an institutional review board, and these are boards in place to make sure that the research being done on human subjects is reasonable and ethical. So if you remember experiments like the Tuskegee experiments, the Stanford prison experiment, the one where they shock you, or you were told you were administering a shock.
Right.
So things like that didn't happen because some of those experiments that involved deception were pretty psychologically harmful to the people involved. And then there are other things with medical treatments or various interventions where people were given things that either weren't effective or were actually harmful. And because of either lack of informed consent, where people like a prison population was used, where they didn't really have a choice about participating, or they just weren't told what could go wrong by participating. You had research subjects damaged through their participation in research. So IRB boards were put in place for specific types of research. Generally, universities make all of their human subjects research go through an IRB, but only certain types are technically required to, like nationally funded stuff. So if you were a student at a university doing human subjects, you may not have to go through that review board. You probably should, but you may not have to if you aren't funded. Right. And so it's a group of people that generally draws from the university. There's typically at least one community advocate. And if you are at some place that does a lot of research involving prisoners, you'll have typically representation from the prison system and a prisoner advocate to make sure that that population isn't being taken advantage of. you aren't going to have an expert on the panel for every type of study you review. And that's
Right.
where something like this, if it was reviewed prior to being carried out, at first glance, depending on how the proposal was written to the board, it could have looked to the person reviewing it, because an exempt proposal typically is going to go to the committee chair and maybe one other person for review to say yes or no to this is exempt.
Okay.
Depending on what you put in there, it can really sway that one way or the other.
Okay. So we did quite a bit of talking before the show, talking about this stuff, and it what is the process, and of course we're drawing on your experience at your institution for your IRBs. I don't know if University of Minnesota follows the same process, but what does it take to actually do that? Is there a process? How long does this process take? What does it look like in terms of, I mean, are we talking like a CFP, like you're trying to, send to Black Hat with an abstract?
That's a good analogy for it. Every university and every board is going to do it a little bit differently. Typically, you have at least two types. You would have exempt and a full board review. A lot of places add an expedited review, where if you have more than minimal risk, but not something that is subjectively great risk or beyond what would be considered minimal, that would go to full board. An exempt proposal is typically shorter. It would have an abstract, some information about your participants, your research methodology. Depending on where you're at, they may want a lit review where you explain the research, risk to participants, benefits to participants, informed consent, and that sort of thing. And then each grade up, depending on how many the institution has, is going to be more involved. So if you wanted to study, say coding in kids, because you have minors involved, that's automatically going to a full board review.
Mm-hmm.
If you wanted to do that same study with adults and you were just giving a survey, you could probably get that through on exempt, because you could do that in a way that's not risky to the participant. But ideally, you would probably be asking that each person to consent to participating in the research, because involving people in research without telling them is generally frowned upon. Right.
Yeah, I've heard of irresponsible. And you mentioned the Milgram. I put a link to the Milgram thing where people were either getting electrocuted or they weren't getting electrocuted, or people would say, oh yes, this person's messing up, and then the researchers were trying to get a person to literally shock somebody and causing issues. I don't know if that one was IRB, but the Milgram experiment was one well-known experiment where something like that had happened. That probably helped build the IRB process. So in your opinion, you think that what they did affect human beings? I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. How do you feel that this affected human beings?
So I would imagine that the Linux maintainers community is not that large. And those patches don't get approved by magic. So since you have someone who is reviewing them, and actually in their apology statement, I think they say, we're waiting for permission from the people who okayed the patches before we can release the ones that were in this study. Because those maintainers could take a major reputation hit having their identities revealed. And that blatantly matching a research subject to the outcome for that individual is a pretty big no-no in research, because if you have people who are fearful that their identity is going to be matched with whatever their results are, it really makes it difficult to get someone to participate. So you have to protect the people participating from potentially negative outcomes. Say they do release the identities of the people who approve the patches.
Yeah,
it's not good.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how they approve those things. and there was I read several blogs talking about some of this stuff that, blogs that were written before this. It's an interesting idea on the trust model involved here. People trust because of the domain the email is coming from, or people trust because they know this person, and it's interesting. Miss Berlin, you're shaking your head here, but so how building trust is a weird thing, especially, one of the biggest, ha-has I have is I don't believe in cryptocurrency, because it's like, oh, it's so easy to just, make off with $500,000 worth of Bitcoin. Well, we trusted coin, we trusted these places to take this money because, they told us, what we wanted to hear. And, one of the things I was like, well, did they build up this trust with the Linux kernel developers to the point where they felt like they could, take those without any issues? Ms. Berlin, what were your thoughts on all this?
I had one and I completely forgot because you went, oh gosh.
Well, how many?
Sorry.
So I'll weigh in. How many did these guys submit at one time? I mean, if it was just one patch, it probably would have gotten scrutinized a lot more. Would you say 120?
Right. There are 190 patches that have been done. And let me see, they're looks like over a 2-day period, according to this.
So that's just overwhelming for even a group of people to go over thoroughly and find everything, even if it was deliberate.
And especially if they're, legitimate with their whole, they wrote their own software to do the, that's what they wrote it for, right? Just to do the patching.
They said the patching came from static analysis tool they developed. Yeah.
Right.
It is more of a gotcha than anything else. I mean, and I have a related analogy here. When you talk about the review boards, I mean, there was a scientist and he was a doctor actually doing research to treat people. And I forgot what the condition was. Apologies for that, because it was maybe 5 years ago I read this, but he basically was commissioning this study, and a team of doctors would review what he was doing. So what he did was, to treat these people, he took half of them, treated them in the hospital, and the other half, he said, well, just stay home, treat you at home, by yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And basically the study showed that people in the hospital had a greater rate of living, and the ones at home had a greater mortality rate. And so he was in the middle of the study. He showed the results so far, and the review board said, you got to stop this study. This is immoral. These people are dying by not allowing them to go to the hospital. The problem was he had switched the results. Actually, the people going to the hospital had a higher death rate. So, there's one case where maybe, a review board may be having the wrong information, or maybe bias in some way, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
I just thought it was interesting.
Okay.
Yeah,
Ms. Berlin. Oh, sorry, Paige, go ahead.
I was going to say, for something like that, where you have very real consequences such as death, studies like that would be reviewed periodically, because if you have one group that's outcome is significantly better than the others, it's unethical to continue. And there comes a point where you basically have to say everybody needs this particular intervention, and it shouldn't matter which one it is. The board reviewing it should choose the better one.
Right. There were 190 fixes, and a good majority of them were like, oh, damn it. I just had the link here. Where did I put that? So it was like, they were all over the place. There was like Nouveau patching, because, it's got fix reference count link in VFIO-MDev, or fix several reference count leaks, and in some ways, I don't know if they put the name in to fix that. And they actually introduced something else, so it made it look like, oh, well, here's a fix for a specific vulnerability, and we're introducing something else on the side. But yeah.
poor naming, or like they mistracked something and it didn't, since there was so much in there. I mean, they just messed up.
Yeah. So there's a link in the show notes to lore.kernel.org, which has the Linux kernel mailing list for all of the reversions that they're having to do. Right now, the biggest problem that they're having is trying to figure out whether or not to keep or to revert 190 fixes. Some of them are like, oh yeah, we need to go ahead and do that, or oh, we don't see any real benefit to keeping this in, or so they're spending additional time that, I mean, and this is an opportunity cost. It's like they could have been working on something else, ideally and hopefully securing something else or making sure that something is a little more secure, than trying to figure out whether or not they need to pull out 190 patches that were put out. So let me see. I really have a problem with how we generate trust in the open source community, and just it. I mean, I follow people on Twitter all the time, and I only know them from their Twitter handles. Sometimes I don't even know what they look like. If if I didn't have my picture in my Twitter handle, why do you know to trust me? Is it because I have a podcast? Because that's an awful example of trusting me because I have a podcast or whatever.
I mean, people put a lot of trust into just random internet stuff. I mean, Linux has been around forever.
Granted, yeah.
Right?
It's got a reputation, just like Bernie Madoff did.
Or a blue check mark.
Oh wow, blue check mark. Yeah,
Number of
exactly.
followers.
Number of followers. Right. And I mean, it's just really weird how we decide, things are trustworthy or not. And it all just seems arbitrary. And, I mean, at least with things like PGP, you had to, back in the day before you could sign them remotely, they had key signing parties where everybody did get together and they had drinks and stuff. And it was not weird not the key sharing parties, key signing parties. What? Shut up, Ms. Berlin.
Well, they had those too.
Maybe, yeah.
If you combine the two, great.
No, not a great night.
That's a
Not
thought.
great night. Oh my hell. But the whole idea historically was, these people, you see them face to face, you shake their hand, and then it's like, oh yeah, I trust that guy. I know him, or, she's pretty awesome or whatever. Stop laughing, Ms. Berlin. It's
the same beginning to both parties.
Oh God. Jesus. Oh man.
Okay, I'm done.
No, yes, you are. No, I mean, but so I mean, there was some really hinky things in here too. Paige, you had mentioned before the show that this IRB thing is very political, and that it is recommended that if you are in the university system and you don't have tenure, that you don't volunteer for these things because they can bite you in the ass politically. It's more like you screw the people below you, or you screw your colleagues, and one day they'll be working for you, or you'll be begging for them for money. How is it really that bad in this academia?
Everything in academia is political. It's one of those, the backstabbing, everything is so high because the stakes are so low, or however that saying goes. But so IRB has two big strikes against it for somebody who's pre-tenure. So in pre-tenure world, a lot of times as an assistant professor, which is what the supervising prof was in this case, which I feel really bad for the guy. You can be let go fairly easily, and a lot of your time has to be dedicated to publishing enough to be acceptable to your university. IRB takes a lot of time. To read a research proposal for something outside of your area of expertise and understand it sufficiently to ask the questions to know what's missing is difficult. Mm-hmm. Asking follow-up questions, because it delays the review time, is often a little
frowned upon.
Yeah, it's not, it's encouraged technically, but it's also problematic because if you're reviewing a grant application and the grant has to get to IRB approval now so it can be submitted and approved, that can get really dicey. especially if you, as an untenured prof, are reviewing for somebody who is tenured. So you've got the time, you've got the politics, and it's
and the key thing you
rough.
said was outside of your expertise. Is that the
Yeah.
case most of the time?
So typically on an IRB board, you've got members of the university committee, and they will draw them from each university area. But just because you work in a department does not mean you have a remote understanding of the person next door's research. So my area was exercise science, and I was applied stuff, and I looked at biomechanics and that sort of thing. I had colleagues who worked on mitochondrial research. I could sort of understand the big picture on some of that, but it wasn't my area of expertise. And then you could also be asked to review something, say for somebody from biology, getting into some animal use stuff where they're looking at what is the impact of this on this animal. And that's completely outside of what you are familiar with in some ways. Or you could be asked to, review a study where somebody wants to go to a war-torn nation and study the people who are living in those conditions. And you can't be an expert on everything. So you rely on the different committee members to inform that. But because like this study came from computer science, a lot of computer science stuff is not going to involve people because, writing code or whatever, that's not really involving people. So it kind of came in as a bit of a perfect storm because I can't describe the Linux kernel maintenance process. I don't know what it is. And I'm guessing most of the people on Minnesota's IRB board can't either. And without having some background there, it's hard to review it. And the time to get the expertise in the background there may have pushed this study, even though it sounds like it was submitted afterwards, past their point of no return. Because typically IRB boards are only going to meet like once a month. So if you have something needing full board review, you have to hope it gets on the docket for that month's review. And if they've got 2 hours scheduled for the meeting and you are unlucky and you are proposal number 3 and the first 2 both take an hour, you just got bumped a month. And I've seen IRB deliberations take an entire meeting where we only talked about one proposal.
Oh, wow.
So you get huge backlogs.
How contentious do those things get?
They get feisty. So sometimes in a full board review, you would ask the PI, the primary investigator, to come in and explain things and ask questions. And sometimes that can get contentious because people feel like their expertise is being challenged. Because it's like, well, I'm an expert here. Why are you questioning my methods? Right. And it can sometimes get a little bit heated between IRB members. So if there was an exercise study and somebody says this is no more than minimal risk, and I have somebody from another department who's not familiar with exercise, doesn't understand what minimal risk in that world means, I may end up arguing with that person about, no, this study meets the definition for minimal risk in this study. It's unlikely to hurt someone given the participant constraints we have. And this other person is saying, no, you're asking someone to walk on a treadmill that can be deadly. So it's like, well, okay, yeah, on face value, walking on a treadmill can be deadly.
Right.
But realistically speaking, in this case, it's not because XYZ. And
that makes sense.
There can be some very spirited debate about those things.
Now, is the hope to get just a well-rounded review board, or is that not really something that's thought about? I just think, it might not be like, your specific area of study, but you may know about a tenth of it really, really well. Is it like, do they try and get all of
so they draw, your board is going to come from typically so university typically has like colleges that are subsets. So you would draw people from each college that would hopefully cover the gamut.
Okay.
And then kind of the other potential issue there is when your IRB board meets, you may not have all your members. So if I was on the board and I knew that somebody from my college had a study coming up, it's kind of expected. You need to make sure you're at this meeting because if there are questions, they're going to be asking you about it. And the same thing for all colleges, but it's not unusual to go to an IRB board where you've only got about half of the people there or whatever you need for the quorum at the time. So even though you've got that well-rounded base, there's no guarantee that the people who best understand the material are going to be at the meeting where it's discussed.
Yeah. Yeah, you had mentioned that it's like worse than jury duty. For those of you not in the US, jury duty is something that people actively try to get out of because it's tedious as shit and usually requires you to sit for long hours in a courtroom, which now is no longer the case. Everything's on Zoom, but it's usually one of the
$5, don't you, a day?
Ooh,
that
$5
is
whole
true.
dollars. Yeah, great.
It almost covers getting there.
Yeah. And then, if you get stuck on a 3-week or, however long trial, you get to suck that up, and some employers don't actually pay you for jury duty or, you're required to do your work after the fact. So, luckily the only time I've ever been called, I didn't have to worry about that, but yeah. If you have a grant, Paige, you're not going to be sitting on the IRB if you actually have a grant that's going to go through that IRB, right?
Right. So if you have if a proposal comes through that you are on in any way, whether as a primary investigator or a co-investigator or anything, you would have to excuse yourself from voting to approve or disapprove or amend or whatever that proposal. And the same would be true for a faculty sponsor. So if I had a grad student putting up a paper, I could not vote on it. I might be in the room for deliberations to be asked questions.
Right.
But depending on what it is, I might even be removed from that.
Right. You'd have to abstain from voting or your vote wouldn't matter even if you voted. So it sounds okay.
Yeah, you abstain.
All right. So one of the other things that I had noticed was that there were several papers that the one of the researchers deleted out of their university folder, and thanks to the Wayback Machine gods, somebody had made made it possible to archive those. So there are a couple of links in our show notes to archive.org to something called clarificationshc.pdf and one called crix.pdf. I'm sure there's probably others, but I don't know what the names of those are. I think I got these off of mailing list or something, Zach Whitaker's mailing list or something. But so the one that was dated, or the one clarificationshc.pdf dated 15 December 2020, clarifications on the hypocrite commit work FAQ. I don't know if this is something, they said that there was a paper that had been accepted to the IEEE in 2021, something called S&P. I don't know what that is. They said it got quite a bit of pushback, and I do believe I had heard somebody mention on Twitter that this had come up before back in November or December timeframe, which I think is the reason I reached out to Paige and said, "Hey, come on." But so they outline it in these 4 pages. They said, we carefully designed the experiment to ensure safety and minimize the effort of maintainers. And it says, step 1, we employ a static analysis tool to identify 3, quote, immature vulnerabilities in Linux and correspondingly detect 3 real minor bugs that are supposed to be fixed. The immature vulnerabilities are not real vulnerabilities because one condition, such as a freed object, is still missing. The immature vulnerabilities and 3 minor bugs are independent but can be related by patches to the bugs. I'm a little fuzzy as to what that means. It's like they wanted to find bugs that aren't real bugs, but they wanted to fix those non-real bugs or something like that. Yeah, it sounds very like FAQ like and real simple, but then anyway, so step 2, we construct 3 incorrect or incomplete minor patches to fix the 3 bugs. These minor patches, however, introduce the missing conditions of the immature vulnerabilities. So at the same time, we prepare 3 other patches that are correct or complete the minor patch. So, okay, so if they find a vulnerability in the kernel, they're looking at A, B, C, D as the criteria. So there's a vulnerability in the kernel that it has A, B, and D. So they send a patch that includes a fix, but also adds the condition to the original bug. So they get A, B, C, and D and make that a complete bug, is what it sounds like. And then they prepare a real patch that fixes the original bug. So the original patch. And then they said, step 3, we send the incorrect minor patches to Linux community through email to seek their feedback. And then, okay, which is good. Then step 4, any maintainer of the community that responds to the email indicating looks good, quote unquote, we immediately point out the introduced bug. So we immediately point out that, hey, we screwed you. In this case, we introduced a bug and then request them to not go ahead and apply the patch. At the same time, we point out the correct fixing of the bug and provide our proper patch.
And all these are unknowing participants.
This is some Linux dev out there is like, oh yeah, this looks good. I'm going to go ahead and patch that, and then
like, it's best.
My bad. Don't commit that. Oh. Shit.
Well, and to be fair, that's what you're supposed to do in research involving deception. You're supposed to tell the people. But that kind of, to me, demonstrates that they knew there was some deception going on, which kind of screams this is human research.
Right. They knowingly deceived. Yeah, they did a social engineering bit on the Linux devs by giving them the carrot with the pill inside. And then the dev eats the carrot and becomes a rabbit or something. I don't know. Something like that. Anyway, but they gave a patch, which is stuff that developers thrive on. Every time I hear, oh, there's not enough people doing kernel development. And it's like, oh yeah, here's a bunch of patches. And the devs are like, yay, people are helping us. And then they're not. So there's definitely a social engineering aspect here, but it's like, so the remainder of the 4 says, at the same time, we point out the correct fixing of the bug and provide a proper patch. In all the 3 cases, maintainers explicitly acknowledged and confirmed to not move forward with the incorrect patches. This way we ensure the incorrect patches will not be adopted or committed into the Git tree of Linux. Depending on who you talk to or read on the mailing list, some of these patches not only did not get shut down and not incorporated or not get removed, they actually were committed and then ended up in the stable kernel. Now, things might have changed since I've read the mailing list, but there's actual new bugs, use after freeze and stuff in the stable Linux kernel. If it has changed since we've posted this on the 25th or 26th of April 2021, I apologize, but just letting you know. So there was definitely some deception going on because one, they are submitting patches and then, oh, developer, you didn't find the mistake, our bad. Here's the real patch. And yeah, it just feels bad. And not to mention the fact that these PDFs were actually deleted out of the researcher's directory. I don't know if it was done maliciously or they were trying to cover tracks or whatever, but thank God Internet Wayback Machine exists. Because there's a lot of additional information here that could have been done. They said, was this human research? We do not consider this human research. The project studies issues with some of the patching process instead of individual behaviors. I disagree with that. And we did not collect any personal information. All they had to do was ask what the patching process was. And individual behaviors, I would say, depends on the developer. Some developers would sit on the patch. Some developers don't want things being added.
They have the people's emails. That is something that is identifiable.
Right.
They may not be disclosing it, but there's record of that somewhere.
Sure. And if you're on the Linux mailing list, the email addresses. The email addresses are on there. I mean, if you go look at the lore lore.whatever links I put in the show notes, the addresses are there. And as a matter of fact, they say if you're going to submit a fix, you need to email these dozen people or these email, these other mailing lists in addition to Linux kernel mailing lists, because these patches obviously affect not only Linux kernel, but these other half dozen or dozen organizations or other mailing lists.
That was our show for this week. You can find show notes for this and all of our shows at www.breakingsecurity.com. You can also find an RSS link on the site to add to your favorite podcatcher. You can find all of us on Twitter. Miss Berlin can be found at InfoSyster, INFOSYSTIR. Mr. Betcher can be found at BetcherPwned, BOETTCHERPWNED. And you can follow me on Twitter at Brian Brake, BRYANBRAKE. We have a Slack. Come join us on our Slack. A lot of great things going on there. A lot of channels of various InfoSec-related subjects. You can get an invite on Twitter by emailing our official Twitter handle for the show at Brakesec, BRAKESEC, or you can email us at bds.podcast@gmail.com. Thank you to all of our Patreon supporters for their monetary assistance by offsetting costs involved in putting out a weekly show. Zoom fees, Libsyn hosting, domain purchase, renewal, equipment upgrades, time and effort building the community we have. We appreciate all of your help and support. If you'd like a t-shirt, stickers, coffee mug, or just to show your support for the show, you can check out our TPub site, www.tpublic.com/user/BDS podcast. We thrive on your feedback. A quick 5-star comment on iTunes or Google Play Store or your favorite streaming service, Spotify, Pandora, what have you, go a long way to gaining us additional visibility. It takes no time at all, and we appreciate your help in spreading the word. That was it for Breaking Down Security this week. Be safe, be well, be kind to one another, take care of yourself because you're the only you have, and we'll talk to you again soon.